All right, Alexander, we have to cover the French elections. Macron is going to be president of France for a second term. He got around 58% of the votes in the second round. Marine Le Pen got a little over 42%. I believe those are the final numbers, give or take. But Macron, a second term as French president. There are a lot of people talking about some shenanigans that took place as well in the elections and in the vote counting. But I think the results pretty much fell in line with what the polls had and what the general sentiment was about the second round. My take on it is that the second round was not nearly as interesting or as dramatic as, say, the first round. I think the first round showcased the collapse of the center. The second round was pretty much a no surprise event.
I think this is exactly right. I'm going to say straight away. I think Macron's win he won with a bit slightly bigger margin than I'd expected. I was expecting it to be 55 to 45. In the end, it was 58 to 42. But what it demonstrates to me, I mean, here you have a universally disliked French president. You have a left and a right that agree on most substantive policy issues. And yet, in spite of that, despite the fact that the left and the right both detest the centre, the left still votes, most people on the left still vote for a deeply disliked centrist candidate like Macron, simply because Le Pen has this label that has been stuck on her. And, the ideological rigidities in France, the structural rigidities are such that a president like Macron, who has failed, I'm going to say he has failed in every important respect. He hasn't transformed the French economy. Growth is basically at a standstill. Debt levels are rising. Competitive levels are falling. In spite of that, he still wins. And this is very bad for France, I have to say this. And you're absolutely right. The big story was in the first round. It showed the extreme disgust that French people have for the status quo, the extreme disgust they have for the centre. The centre collapsed. And yet, this discredited, disliked centre still rules through Macron because people on the left in France can't bring themselves to vote for somebody who's been described to them as right. It really does make you want, in my case, to tear my hair out. I find this so bizarre and so strange. And Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leader of the left, who told people not to vote for Le Pen, he now is hoping that he's going to sweep to victory in the legislative elections in June. And of course, he's clearly angling to become prime minister. But if he does become prime minister, what that will mean in practice is that he will be cohabiting with whom? With Emmanuel Macron.
Yeah, well, I think we said before the elections took place that back when politics made sense and voting mattered, people would vote according to their pocketbooks. I remember the phrase. I think it was one of the Clinton. I think it was Bill Clinton's advisor, if I'm not mistaken, who said it's all about the economy, stupid. That was his mantra, and that was true. But I would say in this brave new world, it's all about virtue signaling and the fear of being branded a fascist, an Nazi, a far righter. I think in today's world, people will easily, I don't want to say easily, they'll stomach the fact that they're going to live in a country that's going to be worse off and that they'll be much poorer and they'll be living in chaotic times as long as they're not branded far right. And it seems that people are fine with that. We can't forget that they branded Le Pen not only far right, but they branded her a Putin stooge as well.
Absolutely.
So a double whammy, I guess.
Yeah, but bear in mind, A number of things to say. Firstly, let's start with the Clintons, because you're absolutely right. They won the election in 1992. Under the economy. Is the economy stupid? But they are the people, the Clintons, who more than anybody else changed politics to move it from politics of economics to politics of identity. Hillary Clinton fought the 2016 election, remember, on identity, on those kind of issues. It was Trump who fought the election in 2016 on things like the economy. So it's fascinating to see how, the Clintons did one thing in 1992, but they managed to sell to everybody on the left and on the centre this alternative type of policies. That's one thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is that it's very weird how Le Pen continues to be branded as far right and all those terrible things that you said, given that, in fact, when you look at her policies, they're essentially very similar to the policies. Her economic policies are almost the same as those of Mélenchon and the left, and her other policies, to the extent that she even believes in them, on things like immigration. As I pointed out in a video I've just done for my own channel, they are not very different now from those of, say, the existing British government. I mean, the kind of very hard things that she was saying she was going to do, she no longer says she's going to do. And yet, she still gets characterized and effectively labeled as this, far right fascist Nazi figure. That again I find extremely strange. And on the being a Putin puppet, you would have thought that wouldn't affect people on the left in France, because on the left her policies towards Russia, NATO, Putin, Ukraine are again exactly the same as those of Jean-Luc Mélenchon and the party that now supposedly leads the left. And yet that label is enough to ensure that a discredited, failed, unpopular, exhausted president, which is what Macron is, will continue to occupy the Elysee for another 5 years. As I said, you can say there's progress, and in the first round, I would agree there's clear signs that there is massive disgust in France with the centre and with the status quo. But until and unless people in France and elsewhere in Europe start to look beyond these labels and start to actually vote in ways that make sense in terms of what they say they believe, we're going to end up with a government from the centre, which, however much the centre shrinks, it continues to remain in power. This was the politics that's perfected by Angela Merkel in Germany. We see its application in France. We've seen it also working in Italy. It is creating immobilism. It is creating destruction in Europe. And there is at the moment no break from it.
Yeah, well, it's the politicians in the center that control the media as well. They control the corporates. They work hand in hand with the corporate. They're actually intimately tied into the elite corporate class. And that is, at the end of the day, their projection is so interesting, because when they label someone like Le Pen a fascist, they are, in fact, the very definition of fascism. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Union, just about every leader in the EU, especially and including Macron, is the pure definition of what fascism is, which is when the government is connected and working with the elite corporate sector. I mean, that is the definition of fascism. Yeah. So I just find it so interesting when they're labeling someone like Le Pen, or any Le Pen, a fascist, when they in fact are the pure definition of fascism. But they control the media, they control the distribution. They control social media. We'll see if Elon Musk has any effect on that.
Well,
We'll
indeed.
see. Another oligarch buying buying a business that's run by oligarchs, but let's
Yeah.
give him time and let's see
see what he
Let's see his actions before we judge. But they control all these levers. Is the phrase "you get what you vote for" is that going to to come into effect with France now? Are they going to get what they voted for a second time? And does that mean that that when the collapse and the chaos really ramps up in France, the people are just going to kind of sit back and say, "Well, we voted for this guy. We can't really complain about it, can we?"
Well, I mean, there will be more decay. This is the other thing. You see, the other problem in France is that there's going to be massive unrest in France. Of that, I have no doubt. There's going to be protests. We're probably going to see a very dysfunctional parliament in a few months, re-elected. No, I can't imagine that Macron's party is going to hold together very well in June. So we're going to see strengthened parties on the left and the right, but note that they won't be working with each other. We could also see a revival of the Socialist and Republican parties as centrist voters who voted for Macron in the presidential election drift back from them. So we're going to see a very uneasy coalition, probably, of the centre and the left, but, with Macron still president, a very weakened political system. But it still will be the system. And short of an outright revolution, by which I mean, people storming the Elysee and, all that kind of thing, which is not impossible in France, but doesn't seem very likely at the moment, then, this state of decay, this state of chaos, this state of decline is going to continue and it's going to accelerate because in order to turn it round, you need a strong, purposeful government like the one France got in 1958 when General de Gaulle took office. But you're never going to see this system that we see at the moment that's been created is almost designed to prevent that. And by the way, what you said about, the corporatist system that exists in France and in Europe is absolutely true. Whatever you may think of Le Pen, whether you like her or whether you don't, whether you agree with her policies or whether you don't, she is a real politician. She goes out, she fights elections, she meets people in, town halls and cities and travels around France, does all the things politicians in democracies once upon a time used to do. Yet she gets labelled with the F word. And, the corporatists in Brussels and in Paris and in Berlin and in Rome and in Madrid and in all of those other places don't. And as you correctly say, they're very effective at using that label against everybody else.
Yeah. So Macron is going to be president of France for a second term, but I think there's another story to this election, and that is that Macron is going to be angling for the presidency of the European Union. He is going to be now the Napoleon of the EU. He doesn't have Angela Merkel there to hold him back. He's not going to be in Merkel's shadows as he was during his first term. He has a very weak Germany, a very weak Olaf Scholz, and I think there's no doubt that Macron is very eager to weaken Germany even more and to solidify France's position as the dominant country in the European Union and his position as the de facto Jupiter of EU, the Napoleon of EU. He also has Christine Lagarde at the ECB as well, who's going to be working alongside him. So, one of the most important stories with regards to this election is that you're going to have a globalist, integrationist Macron angling and moving towards becoming the emperor of all of Europe. I think he wants that. I think he's been angling for this since he first got into office during his first term. He's seeing his future now, his future vision come into fruition, and he's gonna go for it. What do you think he's going to do with the EU?
No, I think you summed it up exactly. I think that's exactly what he wants. The point about Macron is I don't get the sense that ultimately he's very interested in France at all. He's always his concern. It has been Europe. I mean, he became president under the slogan, More Europe. And what he wants is to use France as a kind of stepping stone to become, as you correctly said, the Napoleon of Europe. Unite Europe with himself as the leader, just as, Napoleon the First did. So I think this is very much his plan. But of course, he can't do that effectively if behind him the France that he is elected to lead crumbles. And, he could very well find, what do they say, overarching ambition. Shakespeare once said, it can actually trip over itself. And I think that's more likely because certainly it's true. Germany's in a mess and in a deteriorating mess. Italy, very difficult to see that there's going to be a breakthrough there anytime soon. But Germany's the big one. And, things are not looking well there at all. But it seems to me that much more plausibly, power is not going to drain to Macron. It's going to drain to Brussels. And, it will be people like Ursula at the EU centre who, in default of any effective challenge from the States, are going to be making more and more decisions. I mean, one way of looking at this Ukrainian crisis, and in fact, the best way to look at this Ukrainian crisis, is of a massive power grab by the centre against the states. I mean, the EU centre has strengthened itself enormously. Of course, its foundations are crumbling too. You see the euro losing value against the dollar. You see, Christine Lagarde unable to raise interest rates, unable to stop QE because she knows that if she does that, that's going to create massive problems in Italy and France, especially in France. And of course, she doesn't want to see that. So you see the EU as a structure starting to crack. But I can't really see Macron achieving the kind of things in Europe that he says that he clearly wants to do. I don't even think he has a plan to do it, to be honest, and ultimately, if France crumbles beneath him, if we start to see protests in France, which we will, if we have a dysfunctional parliament in France, if we have a Prime Minister Mélenchon who is hostile to the EU, though I suspect deeply compromised if and when he does become Prime Minister. I'm not convinced he will, by the way, but that's another story. Well, then it doesn't look as if Macron is in a very secure position either. And of course, you shouldn't underestimate how unpopular he still is in France.
Yeah, there was a New York Times article about a week ago which said that once the EU managed to get Macron in as president, that they would then push for an EU-wide embargo on Russian oil. And Macron was very much for this. I mean, he was one of the people that was pushing for this embargo on Russian oil. And this would lead eventually to an embargo on all Russian energy, including gas. And of course, this would just accelerate the deindustrialization of Germany. And but my question is, do you think that Macron, now that he is president of France, now that the EU got their man in France, do you think they're going to really ramp up and escalate not only the economic sanctions, at least whatever they can at this point in time, because they can't do much, but do you think they're going to try to escalate the sanctions with things like full embargoes on Russian products and Russian energy? Do you think they're now going to escalate on the military aid side of things now that Macron is securely in for his second term? And is the goal of Macron and the EU to deindustrialize Germany and create a German vassal state that's completely subservient not only to Ursula but to the United States? In other words, Macron along with the Brussels core, just to destroy Germany once and for all, deindustrialize it and turn it into just another weak cog in the EU wheel.
This is exactly the point about, embargo on Russian energy, oil and gas. Who benefits from all that Russian energy? Germany. It's the German industrial system, the manufacturing base in Germany, which is the foundation or rock of the German economy that is going to be so massively weakened by that. So it's very easy to see how Macron, from his perspective in Paris, and you're absolutely right, he's been the person who's been pushing this idea of an energy embargo hardest of all, apart from the Poles. But I mean, Macron has been pushing it relentlessly. His target isn't Russia. His target is Germany. He wants to weaken Germany even more because, of course, if the weaker Germany is, the stronger, from his perspective, France is, and ultimately he is. So that way, that puts him in a better position to be the Napoleon who leads Europe. It's very bizarre that people in Germany haven't figured it out. But that is ultimately what Macron wants. Just as, of course, Macron also wants a European army, and that's why he's going to push for more military supplies to Ukraine. Again, it's not ultimately because he's interested in Ukraine. It's not ultimately because he's even interested in Russia. Again, what he wants to do is to create military structures within the EU, which France, as the strongest military power in the EU, in Macron's own estimation, will then be able to lead. Problem is, of course, twofold. Firstly, with the oil sanctions, Janet Yellen came along and said, we're held back. This isn't such a good idea. Because if you start imposing sanctions on Russian oil to Europe, that will make oil prices rise globally. And yes, that will affect us in the US as well. And maybe, ultimately we can ride it out and wouldn't be too sorry if we saw Europe sink further. But we have these difficult midterms coming. So, hold back from doing that for now because it isn't really going to work for us well for now. So I think actually it was Janet Yellen, believe it or not, who put a spoke in that particular wheel. But, I think Macron will get his way in the end. And I think the hardliners will get their way in the end. Because ultimately, with this very weak government in Germany, with the Greens in the government who are themselves Atlanticist and anti-industrial anyway, they will ultimately do what Macron wants. They might not do it, this week or next week, but sooner or later, that is what they will do. But the problem is, Macron doing that, yes, he might eventually end up, the suzerain of Europe, but it will be a fragmented and weakened Europe. And a fragmented and weakened France. I don't know to what extent he himself understands this, whether he really understands that what he is trying to do, he's like the parasite ultimately, whose obsession with strengthening Europe is ultimately weakening it, because he has a centralist vision of Europe, whereas the whole of European history is that Europe becomes strong when you have strong nation states vigorously competing against each other. But that isn't something Macron has any conception of or understands, and nor does the leadership in Brussels.
Yeah, my final question is, I just wonder, does the leadership in Germany, outside of the Greens and Olaf Scholz, who seems, by the day, Olaf Scholz seems more and more lost, but he reminds me of like a Mr. Magoo type of figure. Yeah, but my question is he just seems so lost. Does the German political class, do other opposition parties, are there people in Germany that realize that this is not only a war against Russia, and this is not only a conflict in Ukraine and a proxy war that the West is waging in Ukraine, but this is a war that's being waged against Germany as well? I mean, I come back to this theme that we've been talking about since Nord Stream 2, since the cancellation of Nord Stream 2. At the end of the day, this is very much a war which sticks to the NATO mantra. Keep Russia out, keep America in, and keep Germany down. And it seems like NATO and the Atlanticists and the elites, they're checking off all of those boxes. Have the Germans realized that there is a keep Germany down component to all of this? Are they going to wake up?
No, I don't think they have. I mean, there's a few people. Gerhard Schröder, the former chancellor, who's now persona non grata, even in Germany himself. He's been trying to explain this to people, but nobody in Germany is listening. If you go to Germany, I've mentioned this before in previous programs, one of the things that you discover very, very quickly is the extreme provincialism of the German political class. They are not people, to say it straightforwardly, who understand these big things. Sometimes, every so often, you used to get these big figures like, say, Willy Brandt in the past, or to some extent Helmut Schmidt. But basically, by and large, they're people who come from, these very nice, well-ordered small towns and regions up and down Germany. They're very familiar with local politics. They understand those things, that side of politics very well, but they don't understand these bigger pictures, and they don't really see them. And of course, with Germans, I'm sorry to say this, again, I hope people who are from Germany and watching this program aren't going to be offended. They're very easy to manipulate by outsiders, by self-interested outsiders, be they British, French, or American, who frankly run rings around these people. Now, every so often you do, as I said, get a German leader who does see beyond that. Willy Brandt was such a one. To some extent, Helmut Kohl was another. Angela Merkel had the kind of cynicism that, meant that she had a grasp of these sort of things. But the German political class as a whole does not. And at the moment, they're all drinking the Kool-Aid, being, in the battle against these sinister people in the East, who Germans have often had a historic issue with also. And I don't think they see this at all, and I don't think they understand that. And if you explained it to them in the way that you've just done, I mean, they would be baffled by it, because, they've convinced themselves that, they're part of this club with the French and the Americans and the British, and they don't understand at all that this isn't a club that they're really a part of in quite the way that they imagine.
Yeah. It's going to be a club that's going to make them a lot weaker and a lot poorer. That's for sure.
Yeah.
It's not the kind of club you ought to be a member of.
No.
That's for sure.
No.
Right.
The Chinese. I read a very bitter commentary in Global Times by a Chinese official who clearly has figured it out, that the Germans just don't see this, and it showed that they have completely lost patience with the Germans, and that they also realise that the Germans just don't get it.
Yeah. All right. Deindustrialization then at a breakneck
Absolutely.
speed is what awaits Germany, and
Absolutely.
Macron's going to be laughing as he sees it going on. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely.
No doubt about it. All right, we'll leave it there, everybody. TheDurand.locals.com, and go to the Durand shop. Click on, use the code. Don't click on anything. Use the code. Good day. And you will get 10% off. Take care.